All right, so we're back and ready for another deep dive.
Yeah.
And this time we're tackling something I think everyone can relate to,
Hmm.
which is building exceptional relationships, whether they're personal or professional.
Right.
And to guide us, we have Connect
Mm.
by David Bradford and Carole Robin.
Oh, those are the folks who taught that famous Stanford class.
Oh, you mean Interpersonal
Yeah.
Dynamics?
The one everyone calls touchy-feely.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah. So the book takes like decades of their research and teaching, all that Stanford stuff, and turns it into some really useful advice.
That's cool. So it's not just theoretical, right?
No, not at all. They actually use a lot of real stories to bring those concepts to life.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you see these principles playing out in like workplaces, friendships,
That,
families.
though, covers a pretty wide range.
It does, and it really makes you think about your own relationships.
That's awesome. Okay, so one of the big ideas they hit on right away is like the importance of being truly known in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like really letting someone see who you are, warts and all.
Right, because you can't build trust without that vulnerability.
Exactly. And they have this great example with Elena and Sanjay, these two colleagues who are kind of starting to become friends.
Oh, yeah, I remember that story.
So Elena's hesitant to share about this past work experience that, didn't go so well,
Yeah, she's worried that if she reveals too much, it'll make people think less of her.
which is something I think we've all felt at some point.
For sure.
But then the book introduces this tool called the 15% rule, which I thought was brilliant.
Oh, yeah, the 15% rule. That's all about pushing yourself just a little bit outside your comfort zone when it comes to self-disclosure.
It's like instead of holding everything back, you strategically share a bit more, see how it goes.
Exactly. You kind of test the waters, see how the other person reacts.
Right, and then you can adjust from there. And the book argues that doing this can actually build trust faster than always playing it safe.
It makes sense when you think about it. Like, if someone's willing to be vulnerable with you, it shows that they trust you.
Right. It makes you feel like you can trust them too.
And one of the things they really emphasize is the importance of emotions in this whole process.
Yeah, emotions. They talk about how we often try to downplay them, especially at work.
Oh, I'm totally guilty of
Me
that.
too. But the book's like, nope, emotions are important. Express them clearly.
Right, because they're a huge part of who we are and how we connect with others.
Okay, but this is where it gets interesting because they also call out the misuse of I feel statements.
Oh, interesting. Like how...
But sometimes we use I feel to disguise opinions or judgments.
I think I do that sometimes.
Oh, me too. Like saying I feel like you're not listening. But that's not really an emotion, is it? It's more of an accusation.
You're right. It's like you're blaming the other person.
Exactly. So instead of saying I feel like you're not listening, they suggest saying something like I feel frustrated when I don't feel heard.
Oh, that's so much better.
Right. It shifts the focus to your own experience, your own emotions.
And it avoids putting the other person on the defensive.
Exactly. And then they had this story about Liam, who's struggling with a colleague taking credit for his ideas.
Oh, yeah, I remember Liam.
Poor guy. So he's venting to his friend Ben, but Ben falls into that trap of giving unsolicited advice.
Oh, no, that never goes well.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And it actually shuts Liam down completely.
It's like Ben's trying to fix the problem instead of just listening and understanding.
Exactly. And this is where they bring in that story about the tennis coach, which I thought was so insightful.
Well, the tennis coach, remind me about that one.
So he keeps telling his student, you're not committed. And she's totally confused because she's like at every practice, every game.
Yeah.
And it turns out, to the coach, lack of commitment meant she wasn't wearing her uniform.
Oh, wow. That's a huge communication gap.
Right. But once they understood what each other meant, their communication totally changed.
It's a good reminder that even when feedback is delivered poorly, there might be a valuable message in there if we dig a little deeper.
Totally. And the book actually provides a checklist called 10 Ways You Give Away Influence, which is like a self-assessment for identifying those behaviors that can undermine your impact.
Ooh, that sounds helpful. Like what kind of behaviors?
Things like not speaking up about your needs, letting yourself get interrupted constantly, downplaying your accomplishments.
Yeah, I definitely need to work on some of those.
Me too. It's so easy to fall into those patterns without even realizing it.
And then we wonder why we don't feel heard or respected.
Exactly. And speaking of feeling respected, they also have this story about Maddie and Adam, a married couple who hit a rough patch when Maddie becomes a stay-at-home mom.
Oh, yeah, Maddie and Adam. That one really resonated with me.
Me too. It's so common, right? Life changes, and suddenly the old agreements about housework, free time, all that stuff just doesn't work anymore.
And then resentment starts to build.
Exactly. And the book gives us this great framework for renegotiating those agreements before things reach a boiling point.
Like being proactive about those shifts in power and needs as they happen.
Right. Instead of letting them fester and turn into huge blowouts.
And I think that's a perfect segue into our next topic, which is conflict.
Oh yeah, conflict. We've talked about being known, but what happens when knowing each other leads to, disagreements?
Right, because conflict is inevitable in any relationship.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be diving into next time.
Can't wait. I'm curious to see what they have to say about that.
Me too. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll unpack the book's insights on how to navigate conflict like a pro.
Sounds good.
See you then.
Bye. All right, so picking up where we left off.
Yeah, we were talking about how important it is to be truly known in a relationship.
Right, to be seen and understood for who you really are.
But then what happens when knowing each other leads to those, inevitable clashes?
Yeah, because let's face it, conflict is a part of life.
It is, and that's where Connect gets super helpful.
Oh, for sure. They have a whole section on handling conflict that's like mind-blowing.
Remember Mia and Anaya?
Oh, yeah. Their friendship hits a snag when Anaya feels judged by some advice Mia gives her.
Their argument is so classic.
Ugh, it's painful to read because it's so real.
They fall into those same traps we all do, like blaming each other, getting defensive.
Not really listening.
Yeah, all that stuff.
But the book doesn't just leave us hanging there, thankfully.
No, it actually walks us through how they break through that logjam.
Oh, how do they do it?
They start by owning up to their own part in the mess.
That's huge.
It is. And then they express how hurt they felt,
Right.
not just what the other person did wrong.
So it's not about placing blame, but about acknowledging those hurt feelings.
Exactly. And that's where they bring in this idea of emotional math, which I thought was fascinating.
Emotional math.
Yeah, it's like we often try to simplify our feelings,
Yeah.
Like you're either mad or you're not.
Right, like is black
Yeah.
and white?
Yeah. But the book's like, nope, we can hold multiple emotions at once.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Like you can be furious at someone and still love them deeply.
That's a helpful way to think about it.
Right. It takes the pressure off needing to have the right feeling.
And it helps us understand why sometimes someone's reaction seems out of proportion.
Yeah, like maybe there's a whole backlog of unacknowledged emotions fueling it.
It's like all those little pinches of emotion that haven't been addressed can build up into these huge crunches that threaten the whole relationship.
It's like letting dishes pile up in the sink.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
Me too. Like one dirty dish isn't a big deal, but if you keep ignoring it,
You end up with this mountain of dishes.
and a ton of resentment.
Exactly. So it's better to address those small annoyances early on before they become huge problems.
Speaking of small annoyances,
What?
they have this hilarious observation about how managers often expect to receive feedback in a totally different way than they give it.
Oh, really? Like how?
Like they want their team to be super direct and honest with them,
Yeah.
but then they struggle to give feedback that clearly.
Oh, the hypocrisy.
Right. But the book encourages us to use all these skills we're learning to bridge that gap.
Oh, so we can be the change we want to see in our workplace relationships.
Exactly. But you wouldn't believe this. Even David and Carole, the relationship gurus themselves,
What?
almost blew up their own working partnership.
No way. You'd think they'd have it all figured out.
Right. But their story is actually a huge relief,
How so?
because it shows us that this stuff is an ongoing practice, not about being perfect.
So we're allowed to mess up.
Exactly. And so are the experts.
What I loved about that story is how open they are about their mistakes.
Me too. It makes the whole book feel more real, more human.
And it leads to some great advice on navigating those breaks that happen in any relationship.
Oh, like that Japanese art form they talk about, kintsugi.
Yeah, where they repair broken pottery with gold.
So the cracks become part of the beauty of the piece.
That's such a beautiful metaphor for relationships, isn't it?
Instead of trying to hide or erase the breaks in our relationships, we can see them as part of the history, part of what makes the connection unique.
It's like those scars we get from adventures.
They tell a story, they make us who we are.
And that's why this section is so powerful. It makes you realize that conflict, when handled well, can actually make a relationship stronger.
So how do we handle it well?
Well, one thing they talk about is the importance of understanding different communication styles,
Because what works for one person might totally backfire with someone else.
like Liam and Ben.
Yeah, Liam gets frustrated because Ben keeps trying to analyze his problems and come up with solutions.
Right, but Liam just wants someone to listen and empathize.
It highlights how important it is to figure out how the other person best receives support.
What feels helpful to you might feel intrusive or dismissive to them.
And then they dive deep into how to give feedback that actually lands well.
Okay, any tips on that?
Remember that story about the tennis coach and the uncommitted player?
Yeah, the one about the uniform.
It shows that even if someone is trying to give you useful feedback, you might completely misunderstand what they mean.
So it's important to clarify expectations and make sure you're both on the same page.
Exactly. Because the words we use can have such different meanings to different people.
And then they talk about how we bring our own net to every interaction.
Oh yeah, that net of assumptions and interpretations that shapes how we hear things.
It's like we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are.
It's so easy to project our own stuff onto others without even realizing it.
That's why it's crucial to understand our own net as well as the other person's.
Because effective communication is about bridging that gap between two different realities.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, they give us this handy framework for giving feedback that actually lands.
Oh, tell me more.
It's called DXVXF, which stands for dissatisfaction, vision, and first steps.
Okay, break that down for me.
So dissatisfaction is about clearly saying what's not working, what needs to change.
Okay, makes sense.
Vision is about painting a picture of what a better future would look like.
I like that.
And first steps is about identifying concrete actions you can take to move toward that vision.
That's so clear. It's like a roadmap for tackling any kind of change.
And they have this really insightful list called 10 Ways You Give Away Influence.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Right, it's that self-assessment to see if you're doing things that undermine your own impact in relationships.
Remind me what some of those are.
Things like not speaking up about your needs, letting yourself get interrupted constantly, downplaying your accomplishments.
Yeah, those are all so subtle, but can really make a difference.
It's like we're subtly training people to undervalue us.
And this ties back to setting boundaries, which is another huge theme in the book.
Oh yeah, they use Elena and Sanjay's story again, but this time Sanjay asks Elena for a favor that could really hurt his wife.
That's tricky.
It is, and it's a great example of how important it is to honor our own values,
Yeah.
even when it means risking conflict or disappointing someone we care about.
So it's about having the courage to say no, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And Elena's honesty in that moment actually strengthens their friendship in the long run.
Because true friends can handle those difficult conversations.
And what I loved about that section is how they emphasize that setting boundaries isn't selfish.
It's actually an act of self-care and an act of love for the relationship.
It's about protecting ourselves and the connection from harm.
But they're also honest about how difficult it can be to actually do it, especially with those closest to us.
For sure, it can feel so risky.
Like you might damage the relationship.
But they offer some really practical tips for those tough conversations.
Like what?
Focusing on your own feelings and needs, being super clear about what your boundary is.
And being prepared for pushback.
Exactly. And they stress that consistency is key,
If you set a boundary but then keep letting it slide, you're sending mixed messages.
which erodes trust.
Okay, so we've covered conflict, communication styles, feedback, boundaries. What else is there?
Well, they also acknowledge that not every relationship can reach that exceptional level of connection, even with all the best tools and effort.
You mean sometimes it's just not possible?
It's kind of a relief, actually,
How so?
because sometimes you feel like you're doing everything right, and the relationship is still stuck.
It can be so frustrating.
It's like they're giving us permission to let go of that pressure to fix everything.
So are you ready to dive into those stories about when exceptional just isn't possible?
Let's do it. They share some really personal experiences that really highlight this point.
Okay, so we're back and...
Ready to tackle those relationships that, like, no matter how hard you try,
Yeah.
just can't seem to reach that exceptional level.
Right, and this is where the book gets really real, I think.
Totally.
Because David and Carole, they actually share stories from their own lives about relationships that, even with all their expertise,
Yeah.
they just couldn't quite, crack the code on.
Oh, wow.
And it's kind of comforting in a way, you know?
It is, because you think, oh, even the relationship gurus
Yeah.
struggle with this stuff.
Exactly. It makes you feel less alone.
Totally. Like, they talk about Carol's relationship with her mother, who just sounds, like, incredibly judgmental
Oh, I remember that one.
and, like, resistant to feedback.
And then there's David trying to connect with his dad, but his dad just won't open up.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one.
It is, and it's a good reminder that we can't change people, you know? We can only control our own side of the street.
That's so hard, though, especially when it's, like, family.
It is, but it's also really freeing when you can finally let go of that
Let go of what?
burden of responsibility.
Oh, yeah, like feeling like it's your job to fix them or something.
Exactly. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is just accept the relationship for what it is.
even if it's not what you hoped for.
Right. It's about recognizing our own limitations and honoring the other person's choices.
They also have that story about Liam and his friend Ben, remember?
Oh, yeah, where Ben's always trying to analyze Liam's problems.
In Eye for Solutions?
But Liam just wants someone to listen.
Yeah. It's like a classic mismatch of communication styles.
What feels helpful to one person can feel totally intrusive to another.
And it makes you realize, like, how many conflicts are really just about people speaking different languages.
Emotionally speaking, yeah.
We're trying to connect, but we're using totally different tools.
And sometimes you just can't bridge that gap no matter how hard you try.
Okay, so what do you do then? When you've tried everything and the relationship just feels stuck?
Well, the book encourages us to first take a good look at our own net.
That baggage of assumptions and interpretations we bring to every interaction.
Are we projecting our own needs and expectations onto the other person?
Are we really listening or just waiting for our turn to talk?
It's about recognizing that sometimes the problem isn't the other person, it's us.
Wow, that's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, but it's also really empowering because it means we have the power to change things.
So then what? Once we've done that inner work,
Well, then we can decide how much energy we want to keep putting into the relationship.
sometimes the healthiest choice is to step back.
Create some distance.
Yeah.
Protect our own well-being.
That's so hard, though, especially when it's someone you love.
It is, but it's also incredibly empowering to realize that we have a choice.
We don't have to stay in relationships that are draining us or hurting us.
And sometimes stepping back can actually be the thing that allows the relationship to shift.
Really?
Yeah, it might not happen overnight, but it can create the space for change.
Okay, so we've talked about what to do when relationships don't work out the way we hoped.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those times when we do manage to build those exceptional connections?
Right. What does that even look like?
They describe it as this feeling of, like, deep trust, honesty, and a commitment to each other's growth.
It's about knowing you can be fully yourself, warts and all, without fear of judgment.
They talk about it as this feeling of freedom.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, right?
It is, because it's like, once you feel truly seen and accepted, it frees you up to take risks, be more creative.
Yeah, to step outside your comfort zone.
Because you know that even if you stumble, you'll be met with compassion and support.
There's a safety net there.
You're not going to be abandoned or ridiculed for making a mistake.
And that kind of safety net allows you to really thrive.
Individually and as a couple, or as a team even.
And one of the things they emphasize is that building these kinds of relationships, it's not a destination, it's a journey.
Yeah, there will be bumps in the road.
Conflicts, misunderstandings, all that stuff.
But the key is to keep showing up.
Keep communicating, keep working at it.
It's like that metaphor they use about climbing Mount Washington, remember?
Oh, yeah, with all the different trails.
How it's notoriously dangerous.
But the view from the summit is supposed to be breathtaking.
And just like with mountain climbing, you need that strong foundation of trust and communication
To navigate the challenges.
to know that your partner's got your back.
And that sometimes you reach a point where you have to make a choice.
Do you keep pushing towards the summit?
Or do you turn back?
Because not every relationship is meant to reach that peak.
Sometimes it's wiser to just appreciate the connection for what it is.
So are you ready to embark on your own journey toward building more exceptional relationships?
I think so. What's the first step?
Well, the book gives us this great challenge. Pick one relationship
All right.
and apply the 15% rule.
Share something outside your comfort zone
See how it's received.
and adjust accordingly.
It's a small step, but it can have a huge impact
You might be surprised by what you discover.
about yourself and the other person.
And remember, it's about progress, not perfection.
There will be awkward moments, missteps, maybe even some conflict.
But that's all part of the process.
And even if the relationship doesn't magically transform overnight,
You'll have gained valuable insights.
and stretched your own capacity for vulnerability and connection.
Well, that's a wrap on our deep dive into Connect,
By David Bradford and Carole Robin.
a book packed with practical advice, relatable stories, and I think some really profound insights.
Hopefully this has given you some new tools and inspiration to build more meaningful relationships.
In all areas of your life,
Remember, connection is at the heart of what makes us human.
it's what gives our lives meaning and purpose.
So keep those antennae tuned in
Stay curious.
and keep exploring those connections.
You never know what amazing discoveries await you.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Until next time.